All right, this is Star Wars from the Bacta Tank. Today we're going to be discussing and breaking down Andor's second season, specifically the first 3 episodes. If season 1 sometimes flirted with emotional dread, this season opens up with something much sharper, something that I would call a nihilistic edge that doesn't just haunt the story but actively shapes its world. From the very first moments, there's a palatable sense that sacrifice isn't just part of the narrative arc. It is the narrative arc. It feels almost intentionally absurdist, as if the writers took cues from Albert Camus and his whole philosophical existentialism, building a world where meaning is carved out of suffering and rebellion is its own end and not a guarantee of hope. That is very nihilistic.
It is. It is. And it's supposed to, when you think about it too, you have to actually throw in the fact that this has to connect to Rogue One. And especially in consideration of Cassian's story and it for himself. We know where Cassian's story ends and how it comes to that conclusion and the meaning of that conclusion too. Andor, the series, is a build-up to this. A build-up to that.
And I think that because this is a sequel series or a prequel series of sorts, we know the outcome.
Yeah.
And that works in the narrative's favor. That doesn't always work in the narrative's favor. Oftentimes it removes mystery, it removes mystique, and it also removes our own personal fears and attachments to our characters because we don't allow ourselves to become overly attached to characters that we know don't have a future. But what this series is doing is it's forcing us to develop a rapport with the very characters that we know will not enjoy the very hope that they are fighting for, except for perhaps Mon Mothma. But as we see, and we will be discussing in this particular opening 3 episodes, she may survive, but what does she lose?
Yeah, what is her price that she has to pay?
Yeah, what does she lose in the process? And what's striking is how Andor pushes the envelope without losing itself. The show knows exactly what it's doing, and it's working. But I will say this now. Any future storytellers who think they can casually pick up Tony Gilroy's mantle should proceed with caution. He's achieved something here that most others probably couldn't or wouldn't even dare to attempt. And that's what makes this season already feel different, heavier, and frankly, even more necessary. So let's get into it, David. Give me your initial thoughts.
My initial thoughts of Andor season 2 was I entered this season very apprehensive, but also very intrigued of where we're going to go. Because since season 1, I've stated we know the ending. It's like what you said, what you alluded to. When you know the destination that we're heading towards, that can make a story kind of fall flat. Because, well, we know where it's going. Why should we be interested? But I give a lot of credit now to Tony Gilroy because he is, since season 1 and now with these 3 episodes, he's really shown his I guess you could say his directing and creative chops by creating these characters that we all are invested in. I mean, if you ask a lot of Star Wars fans, season 1 of Andor is arguably everyone's favorite. And a lot of the characters in Andor are a lot of like newer fans' favorite. Cassian has become almost kind of like the flagship character of Star Wars that everyone kind of looks to kind of be the front and center for Star Wars as a franchise, right? And the fact that basically I went into this entire series kind of apprehensive and saying, well, we know where it's going to end. I know Cassian's fate is dying on that beach holding Jyn as the Death Star blows him up on that beach. But I give a lot of credit to Tony Gilroy because he's adding these, and I saw him say this in an AP interview with Diego Luna. His goal is to make layers of these characters to actually, that's how we're going to be caring about these characters, because they're going to be so in depth and we're going to relate with them and they're going to feel like real characters.
Right. Well, David, your apprehension is slightly different than mine. My apprehension has a lot to do, and it hinges, I should say, on the envelope that is being pushed. Am I all for pushing the envelope? Absolutely. I think that's what brings new life to a franchise. It's what opens new possibilities for new stories. Without pushing that envelope, what we do is we could become static in our IPs, and we regurgitate. We live off simply nostalgia and fan fiction, and we need someone willing to say, fuck all that. Let's introduce new ideas, and not just new ideas that are more the same. They're just slightly different, but let's push that envelope. And the reason why I say that's a good thing, but also there's some apprehension, is because if you push the envelope too far, there's an argument to be made that this is no longer Star Wars. And that's not a negative, because so far what Tony Gilroy has done is absolutely fine. But that's why I started the discussion, David, with the statement that other directors, other writers who think they can just pick up right where Tony Gilroy left off. Well, he did this, so, I can do that. It takes a type of talent to understand how far to push that envelope.
Yes. Yeah.
And so far, Tony Gilroy, up to this point, has managed to be careful how far he pushes Star Wars so that it doesn't break. And there's one aspect specifically that I'm talking about, and that's during, I believe, the third episode, where the mention of rape,
yes,
as well as the explicit act of, was portrayed in Star Wars. Now, we didn't see the actual rape take place, but the explicit act of attempting to rape someone was put into Star Wars. Now, understandably, David, we're dealing with an evil empire that destroys planets and people. They're genocidal. So obviously, rape would be probably part of their strategies. There would be no qualms about doing such things. And a critical mind, when watching Star Wars, could probably presume that these things do happen. Obviously, if you're killing people willy-nilly and you have no guilt when you're doing so, then rape would mean nothing. So as Star Wars fans, we can possibly surmise that within the diegetic landscape of Star Wars, the story world, these types of things probably are in fact happening. But thinking they may happen or are happening through implicit means is very different than seeing it and saying it.
Yes.
And you have to be careful, because how much of those types of aspects actually work with the concepts that form Star Wars. Mm-hmm. Star Wars at its core is about good and evil, right?
Yes.
So something like rape could definitively work just fine on the evil side of that spectrum.
Yes.
But again, Star Wars has never been that type of franchise that delve into those types of social commentaries. And when you do, Star Wars does, in fact, become something very different. Now, the caveat to that, David, is perhaps Star Wars needs to evolve into something different, because the way it's growing currently is not working with Star Wars fans. And I would even add this, Dave. Perhaps many of us don't even realize Star Wars actually has to grow and mature with us, because the bulk of the Star Wars fans have grown up thinking Star Wars should be a certain way.
Yeah.
And Star Wars was designed, according to Lucas, although we know that's not completely true, that Star Wars is geared towards 12-year-olds, right?
Yeah.
And Disney has continued along those lines. But let's be clear. 12-year-olds today, in the year 2025, are very different than 12-year-olds from the late 70s the 80s
The
and
80s.
early 90s.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, 12-year-olds are way more mature. They're not playing with toys. They're exposed to things that children our age at that time were not. So perhaps this is the direction Star Wars should be taking. So when I say we must proceed with caution and we should be a little hesitant, at the same time, maybe this is the direction Star Wars should be going. Maybe the more grounded avenue, pushing that envelope, maybe that is what should be happening, since when you look, Rogue One pushed the envelope. Andor Season 1 pushed the envelope. Andor Season 2 has pushed the envelope. And what has worked the most in terms of Star Wars across the board unanimously with both hardcore Star Wars fans and casual Star Wars fans is the Andor Season 1 and Rogue One.
Yeah.
So that's an argument to be made now that perhaps this is what future Star Wars should in fact be.
You bring up a valid point because, like, for the longest time, I think that people have looked at Star Wars as it's supposed to be kid friendly, right? But that it's a really complicated
But
issue.
what is a kid?
Exactly. What is a kid? There's so many factors when judging what is an IP franchise, specifically Star Wars, because, like, we know that Star Wars has to be marketed to the mass audiences, and partially that's why Lucas says, well, it's geared for kids, because that's the mass audience that probably watched Star Wars back in the day. Now you're seeing more of the mass audience much older. The mass audience is much more varied, and it's just not kids watching it, it's adults. So,
And right, and the adults who are the hardcore viewers are the ones who grew up with Star Wars, and we're unhappy with certain things of Star Wars, meaning, and I say we, I'm generalizing as a group. There are a lot of complaints about nearly everything that Disney's doing, and granted, they're not doing the greatest job. We can understand that. But when so many Star Wars fans dislike so many things, I'm wondering if it's not just the authorship anymore. Perhaps we are viewing Star Wars through rose-colored glasses because we remember how it changed us and how we felt. And we're not feeling that anymore because it's still being made, or Star Wars, I should say Disney, is trying to use Star Wars to still adhere to childish fantasies.
yeah.
And the thing is that the children that they're trying to allegedly connect with are not the same as we were. There's something to be said about culture that has changed and blurred the lines between adulthood and childhood. And that's why, again, bringing it back to Rogue One, perhaps this is the direction. And the reason why I start the show this way, David, is because I want to circle back. We're going to move on now, but I want to circle back at the end of Season 2. Okay? So this is my thesis, I guess you can say.
Okay.
And we will answer it, hopefully, by the end of the second season. Perhaps this is the direction Star Wars should take from now on. I'm not saying there shouldn't be potentially other Star Wars that's a little more fun and loose, has more levity, but the mature angle. Perhaps we should stop viewing Star Wars as a property for 12-year-olds.
Yeah.
Because the view of Star Wars is for 12-year-olds has been creating the things that we don't like.
That we don't like. Yeah.
Whereas here, Rogue One, there's a reason why it's connecting with so many people. Yes, it's written exceptionally well, but it's also, there's a maturity there. There's a realism there. There's a grounded aspect that connects more with a society that's no longer filtered through fantastical lenses. We see reality a lot different than we did 20 or 30 years ago because we're living in a very divisive time.
Yeah.
All right, let's move into what this series has done so far with these opening 3 episodes. Let's look at Cassian, since he is the lead, but I'm going to say what I said last year or last season. I love this show. I don't have a lot of problems with it, but the only thing I can point to is the name. Yes, Cassian is the vessel. He's the motivating, I guess you can say, character in a lot of ways. His story weaves in and out of different people's lives.
Yeah.
But I also think the show is far more grand in scale than just simply Andor. You have Luthen, you have Mon Mothma, you have numerous, other rebel factions being introduced. You have one that then splits into two. That I'm not quite sure what the purpose of that is,
Yes.
other than, hey, we're on Yavin 4 this whole time, and also perhaps this is the beginning of the different rebel factions, the idea that eventually they're going to all have to come together, that there's infighting.
Yeah.
And that at the end of the day, they're all going to have to align their ideologies together in order to fight the greater enemy, which is the Empire. So, David, did you have the same questions when we were watching this episode, the opening episode? Like, what is Cassian doing on this planet? Why is he here for so long?
Yeah, that's what I was kind of surprised with how they started season 2, because I was expecting, and probably it's because, we started, since one of the tones in season 1 was like this kind of like this slow burn where you're getting introduced slowly to this character, and by the end of season 1 we've come to understand a little bit more about Cassian's life. Gilroy took a totally different turn for season 2, and you're just dropped into it. We're saying this is for I think it was Cassian's been doing this for a full year.
Yeah, a year later. Yeah.
And now it's kind of he's just in there. He's this operative. He has this handled now. He has a certain way of handling things, and he's good at it. So it's kind of when he drops us in on it, I was kind of surprised. Whoa, that was kind of a surprise. And I wasn't sure if I would liked it or not, because just like you said, it was kind of it leaves so much questions. It's well, what the heck has Cassian been doing for all this time?
Well, you get the idea that he was training for this specific mission. There was confusion, lack of communication or miscommunication. He obviously was sent to that Imperial base to steal the prototype. But the TIE fighter was not the exact same ship that he was sent to steal. It's a very different ship. And I will say the way the episode started was quite interesting, because what we saw now was an Andor who's slightly different from last season.
Yeah.
Someone who's a little more indifferent. A lot of first season was geared around this idea that these enemies make their own enemies through their very actions. Like the Empire creates enemies unnecessarily.
Yeah.
Unnecessarily. They turned all of Ferrix into foes because of what they did. And you took someone who had no interest in being a part of a rebellion or fighting against the Empire, and you turned him into an enemy, which is Andor.
Yeah.
So you have someone who was relatively indifferent, possibly even a little selfish, and now you see him being a little more caring to this other Imperial spy or rebel spy working within the Imperial ranks.
Yeah.
And you see someone, David, and I bring this up because this might be something very sad. So you see how he handles, and this is intentional. This has to be intentional. So you see how he handles this particular rebel spy.
Yeah.
Who is anxious, nervous, not sure what to do. Could possibly sacrifice the entire mission or mess it up if she doesn't get in control of her emotions or actions. Now, we saw something very similar in Rogue One.
Yeah.
And what did Andor do? He pulled out his blaster and shot a fellow rebel officer because he was acting irrational.
Yes.
Very different Andors. And that has to be intentional, because you see someone who's maybe not so jaded yet, who has a semblance of hope.
Exactly.
And it makes it even more sad and nihilistic. Not existential, nihilistic. Because you see someone who starts off one way, and we already know that something changes so profoundly in 4 years to where he simply decides to pull a gun out and shoot someone in order to save the mission.
Yeah. And that, it took me about the second time to watch it to actually put those pieces together.
Yeah.
Because I forgot, as I was watching Andor season 2, the whole point of this series in total, it is supposed to lead to Rogue One.
Yeah.
And just like what you said, that's when it dawned on me. This is a mirror play of the first scene that we see Cassian in Rogue One. And you see like the difference in him. Just like you said, he by the time in Rogue One, it's almost like he doesn't have any hope.
He goes from being someone that is possibly jaded, but still has a semblance of hope, to Rogue One, where he almost becomes, now that we know he has a mentor in Luthen, his actions resemble and mirror Luthen in Rogue One.
Yeah. And like that's what makes the story of Rogue One even more impactful, because it takes a person like Jyn Erso to change him, to give him that hope back, and make him do the one thing that he's probably been missing this whole time, which is meaning.
Or possibly even remember, maybe it's not even hope when we look back now that we know what's leading up to Rogue One.
Yeah.
Maybe it was never even necessarily hope that Andor had in his own survival, but it was hope in his actions having meaningful ramifications for the galaxy itself.
Exactly.
So when are we going to see that connection where, okay, I might not survive this, but that doesn't mean I give up the fight? When does he become more like Luthen in that mindset, in his thought process? Because Luthen's already decided, based on the first season, that he will not have a part to play in the future.
Yeah.
That he has done too much. He has lost his soul.
Yeah.
So is that something that Andor is going to also acknowledge? Are we going to see him have that acknowledgement so that we then have that connection that makes more sense, going from an Andor we see in the beginning of season 2 to what he becomes in Rogue One? Someone that is willing to sell his soul and make those gray decisions like assassination, because my soul is already lost, but by doing this, I'm going to be able to help the whole.
Yeah.
It's very utilitarian in a lot of ways.
It is. And this is what I mean when I alluded to the fact one of the strengths that Tony Gilroy has been doing is adding these complexities to these characters.
Yeah.
Where it's kind of like, it's not a simple, this is who he is, or simple black and white when it comes to these characters' actions. There's complexity to it now. How does Andor get to that point where we see him in Rogue One when we just saw him pull off pretty much the polar opposite of like what he did in the beginning of season 2? Now, I liked the beginning. I mean, it had a very Star Wars-esque, like high fantasy type of quality to it, with him hijacking the ship and the chaos that ensues. But also on the second go around, I began to realize, like what you were alluding to about that, the meaning of what Tony Gilroy is trying to say with how we are in a time frame where everything is chaotic. Like the Empire does things to simply damage themselves for some strange reason. And it's because I think one of the overall themes that we're seeing with Andor is, and it ties back to what Star Wars or Rogue One originally wanted to bring, which was the war element back into Star Wars, which is to show that in the middle of a rebellion or a war, chaos usually ensues, and especially if like you have all these little factions vying to rebel, but there's nothing unifyingly tying them together, so they're just going to be bashing into each other. Meanwhile, the Empire is ruling over everything, and they do their stuff to control their, foothold on everything. But in doing so, it creates chaos in other aspects.
Yeah. Well, it really is connected to wartime politics in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Tony Gilroy has definitely done his study of wartime politics and wartime philosophy, because he just consistently gets it. Like, he gets the material. And I'm not talking about Star Wars specifically. I'm just talking about the things that he's using, his influences. You know, the idea of the highlighting how unwieldy rebellions become as they scale up. We saw that in Rogue One. It's one of the first times we saw that the rebellion wasn't this unified front against the Empire.
Yeah.
But in fact, it was several splintered factions working not together but separately, which when it comes to rebellion against Empire, that's what empires want.
Yes.
Empires in general, they don't want a unified rebellion. They want fractured rebellions that hopefully do what? Turn on themselves. And isn't that what Dedra's plan was with Krennic?
Yes. see what I mean about creating chaos.
Yeah. So the philosophical and political understanding going into this series in terms of writing is so top notch, because you have that whole aspect of Dedra and the new Imperial mission. We now know that she did, in fact, Dedra, let's move into her a bit more. She survived the Ferrix attack, which we all knew she would. And now she's a part of a group that's been organized by Krennic. We can assume it's connected to the Death Star project, right? Project Stardust, I believe,
Stardust
is the name, if my Star Wars nerd memory serves me correct. And the major narrative, or plot, I should say, has to do with Krennic and Dedra working together to oversee the gouge mining of Gorman, which is a planet.
Yeah.
I believe was that the name of the planet, Gorman?
Gorman.
Yeah, Gorman. And I could only assume it has to do with Death Star materials. That would make sense logically. We don't have a lot of time left in this series to go off into other avenues of weapon building. It's going to have to be pretty concise and pretty specific. But David, what did they talk about? What were their plans before they decided to use rebellion itself to confuse things and to create avenues so that they can infiltrate and gouge mine? What was their other suggestion? Propaganda. And it wasn't just the word propaganda. Propaganda, David, we hear that word so much. And what we're doing right now, in a lot of ways, can be considered propaganda in certain circles. What are we talking about? Star Wars. How are we talking about Star Wars? Is it pro? Is it against? Are we putting political thoughts in here? Is there ideological thoughts? You can start to whittle this away and be like, okay, well, these guys are speaking in propagandic terms. We're not, but you can argue that. So it's not just a matter of saying propaganda. If you say propaganda for audience reasons, I'm talking about us as the viewer now, David. When we ingest that word propaganda, that's a word we hear all the time. It doesn't have impact anymore. So what do those two gentlemen actually say? They actually use the definition of what propaganda does, the definitional causation, the destruction that it causes is what they use to explain. And it wasn't until Dedra told Krennic when they were discussing the plan, when he asked her what's your plan, what's your strategy, it wasn't until she defined it as propaganda that we're like, oh, propaganda.
Exactly.
That's the power of this show and how it's written, because anyone else would have just said, well, this propaganda means we can do this, we can do that. No, they described propaganda without using the word, which is far more impactful, because this goes back to something that you and I talk about a lot. Language is important.
Yes.
Language is important. It comes with so many meanings. And unfortunately, the word propaganda has been so fucking watered down in this contemporary moment that it doesn't have power anymore.
Exactly. That's the thing that basically I really liked about that scene, especially into context with what prior we see Dedra do, because we get to see that she can be very manipulative. She's very smart. So
she's my future wife. I'm just gonna say that.
Are you gonna flop on the bed like Cyril?
Oh yes. Like, listen, I want a wife that defends me.
That's me. I know. I was
listen. We're all man babies. Let's just be honest. There isn't a man out there that was like, I wish I had someone to defend me.
I had someone to defend me. But that scene, even though it was freaking hilarious, because like
It was so powerful, though.
there was like this context. The context of it was so powerful because like you also have to throw in the fact that that scene, the only reason why it happens is because of what happens in season 1, where Cyril actually saves Dedra in the very end from in that battle.
Yeah.
And then it leads to this, and 1 year later, they're a couple now, and I don't want to say she's manipulating him.
No, I think she likes him. I think that's clear.
She likes him,
Yeah.
but like Dedra is so smart, and I think it just comes naturally to her that she's able to manipulate Cyril and his mother. And then when it goes into the whole I guess you could say meeting with Krennic, you get to really understand, and it establishes just how smart she is, because she actually explains, while the two other officers are just throwing the word propaganda around, Dedra breaks it down even further. Says, no. You're seeing it too shallow. You're seeing it too narrow. This is what we need to be doing. And it's like, it really establishes her character. I don't want to say at this point she's evil. I don't think she's evil, but she's very smart and she's very manipulative.
There's a reason why they're writing her this way. She's not the definitive evil. She isn't supposed to be evil.
She's not supposed to be.
Now, last season, you can argue, okay, what are they doing? Are they setting her up to be this evil villain? By the end, it was pretty clear that that's not what they were doing with her. They were trying to sow some seeds of sympathy for this character.
Yeah.
And what they did with it in these opening 3 episodes, Dave, I think it's now clear that they're trying to say that she isn't evil, but she's a product of the very situation she grew up in.
That's a better way of putting it. Yeah.
And because when she said she had no parents and that she grew up and she was raised on the Imperial kinder block, that puts her in a completely different light, because, David, she's over here on one side preaching about propaganda.
Yes.
When she herself is a product of propaganda and adolescent brainwashing. So she's now a victim. So what's going to happen, David, with her story? Are we going to see someone, I'm not saying a redemption arc, but are we going to see someone who comes to the conclusion that what they're doing is evil? Because it's a thin line, David. Okay, I had this conversation with my brother the other day. We kept going back and forth with Dedra as a character because by far she's one of the most interesting and, or I should say, intriguing and complicated characters.
Well, you've declared that you want her as a wife.
Well, forget that for a moment. That was just me being stupid. Even though I love her pinched militant face, like, just please be militant with me. Why'd you have to bring us back there, Dave? What was I saying?
You before the whole pinched militant face, you were mentioning how her character in itself is like become just as complex as Cassian.
Yes. Okay. So you can look at people like Dedra and say, "Oh, they're evil because they're part of the Empire." But you have to remember, historically, this is heavily influenced by Nazi Germany, Civil War times. That's all been discussed numerous times, as George Lucas has mentioned his influences for the Empire. So knowing that, if we go look at Nazi Germany, for example, there were a lot of people who were nationalistic, who were racist pieces of shit. But being racist doesn't mean I'm going to push a button and destroy millions of people.
Yeah.
That's why when it came out, what was happening to Jews during Nazi Germany, there were certain German citizens who were like, okay, this is not what I thought this was about. Nationalistic, kicking Jews out, yes, but the systematic murder of all these people, that's not what I signed up for. I'm wondering if that's what they're going to do with Dedra, because there's got to be a bigger reason why she didn't want to be in charge of the Gorman mission?
Yes.
Does she really want to be responsible for destroying an entire world? And if she has qualms there, what's going to happen when she finds out that she's working on a project that is literally connected to the building of a space station that is solely designed to annihilate entire worlds?
Essentially to commit genocide.
Correct. So there's a big difference between signing on the dotted line. Yes, I'm for the Empire. I'm for this type of imperial control. I'm about rule of law. And complete and utter genocide. There's a difference there. So is that what they're going to do with her character here? Are they trying to say, well, she isn't all evil. She's simply a byproduct of her being exposed to imperial ideology from the very time she was a child. And when she's confronting other real world possibilities, is she going to have to reconcile those beliefs?
Well, that's the interesting part. That's one of the intriguing elements that I've always had with Andor in total since season 1 is like, it's not about showing how evil the Empire is. The series itself has been able to show the pros and cons of both sides of the side of the rebellion and the side of the Imperials, where it's kind of like at the end of the day, the war itself is like what is destroying these people because of all the chaos it causes. And yeah, the Emperor is the one who started all this bull crap. And basically that's why we have what the basis of Star Wars is. But like showing the elements like what's happening with Dedra, where she's not evil, but she's trying to live in her own means. Meanwhile, you look at Cassian's the same way. It's like he's just trying to survive in his own means, his way of where he essentially has chosen the side that he's on, which is the rebels. Both characters are kind of like stuck at this impasse where we know that they're not bad characters, nor are they good characters. They're just people trying to survive with it in the situation that they've been given. So that's what it makes it really interesting. That's why out of all the characters in Andor, the two characters that I've always resonated with besides Cassian is Dedra.
Yeah.
I started with Cyril, but then, unfortunately Cyril's become like such a punching bag. It's like, I'm like going, no, dude, you need to get a backbone. Okay, here comes Dedra. Thank God.
I'm still intrigued by his character because I've realized what his place is, and this could change. But in a lot of ways, David, I think he's the ordinary person, and this is an important part of the story when you frame it this way. The ordinary person in stories like this have a part to play because empire cannot take root. Fascism cannot take root without the enabling power of the ordinary people. And he is that representative, in my opinion. I think he's the regular person who just supports authoritarian rule. And it shows that things like authoritarianism, fascism, empire cannot become a thing unless you have the support of the ordinary Joe Schmoes. And he is a believer. Why is he a believer? We're not quite sure. Is it about control? Does he respect the power and control, something that he's never had over his own life? We know through the study of people in general, the psychology of certain individuals, many times people like Cyril believe in that type of power is because they never had it. They never felt the safety and comfort of having that type of control and power over themselves. And when we see how his mother, in fact, treats him, he is a person who has no control over his life. Even Dedra, who I don't think is someone who wishes ill will on Cyril.
No.
She cares for him, but also, what does Dedra do? She decides for him. She protects him.
Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, I think that's his story.
That's a good point because when I think about it now, I mean, Cyril falls into the category of like character categories in the series, kind of like Bix, and kind of like probably not much.
No, I think you're right. Bix is on the opposite side of the spectrum of that.
Yeah.
The ordinary victim.
The ordinary victim, you know, both are victims of the system that they're in. It's just how each person develops
Correct.
from that system. And it is kind of humorous to me thinking about it now, because I didn't realize it, that his mother has been so overbearing on him. That's how he's been controlled most of his life. And then Dedra comes in, who literally tells his mother that she needs to stop with the negativity.
Yeah.
And instead, Dedra just takes the reins, and she controls Cyril. And it's still about control.
It is.
He's still being controlled by
She
someone.
designates his life for, even though she's helping him.
Yeah.
But look at what she does. I will make sure Cyril sees you at least twice a month. I will make sure he calls you. So she is taking control of his life, not because she's evil and bad, but because she cares about him and she feels that he needs assistance. But that's not my point. My point is that his character craves control and power.
Yeah. But it's not, you could probably say he probably doesn't even crave it for himself.
He probably doesn't fully even understand.
He doesn't understand.
I think there's a lot of people like that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people out in society that don't understand why they crave certain forms of governance, certain forms of entertainment, because it's wish fulfillment.
Yeah. It's just, I just crack up because like that whole scene, for me, the first time I saw it, I thought it was just like all comedy, because especially when Cyril just flops on the bed and he's so pathetic. I'm like going, bro, come on. But when you actually take a look at the context, it's really interesting thinking about it, how like he does, just like we said, he's a character that craves control and order, but just like majority of people out there, is the control, do they want to have control? No, they want someone to control it for them so that it could possibly make their lives easier.
Yeah. Stay in that mic, Dave.
Oh, sorry.
So moving over to Bix, we talked a little bit about the whole rape aspect. I won't go into it again.
Oof, dude.
But there was a part of me. It was uncomfortable for a lot of reasons. It was uncomfortable just because rape in shows in general is never like, yeah, this is awesome. You're never doing that. It's always uncomfortable. But it's also double uncomfortable, or I should say twofold, because it's Star Wars.
Yeah.
And I'm like, ooh, are we doing this right now? Is this a thing? Are we really going down this avenue right now for Star Wars? So I feel conflicted, David, without going into it too much. I'm a bit conflicted with the rape aspect, not because it bothered me necessarily, and I don't feel like it's wrong to have that in Star Wars, but let's be clear. It changes Star Wars.
Yeah.
It changes Star Wars. Seeing someone about to get raped in the world of Star Wars changes the context of Star Wars in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll go back to that specific aspect at the end of the season. I feel like answering this question more fully has to be answered when we try to answer the thesis
because
I set up.
Because it's a very complex issue that Star Wars has.
And they may end up doing it again, maybe not rape in general, but they may end up pushing the envelope in this type of fashion in another upcoming episode. So I want to have more there.
Yeah.
Before, like more pieces of evidence before we fully answer the question. But just as dark is Mon Mothma. Okay. So prior to Mon Mothma losing all control of herself, we witnessed the death of a major character. Is it Brasso? Brasso. Which pushes the entire tone of the 3 episodes into a very dark area that works analogous to what's happening with Mon Mothma on Chandrila. Is that how you say that home planet? Chandrila?
Yeah.
So Mothma's story here is very similar to everyone else's story in these opening 3 episodes. It's reminding us of the situations they're in, reintroducing some of these concepts while expanding on them, fleshing them out just a bit. And what we found happened over the past year within this diegetic story world is that Mothma's friend, the one who helped her hide her money, the money she was spending on rebellion, through the entire finagling and setting up of this Chandrilan traditional wedding with a criminal, all of that's connected and tied in. But what it amounts to now is blackmail.
Yes.
Her friend, shockingly, is trying to blackmail Mon Mothma into making sure he becomes wealthy and made whole as well. Because through her dabbling and behind the scenes working with the rebellion, the end result has hurt him financially. And he's grown angry, resentful that everyone seems to have what they want, but he has nothing.
Yeah.
So this has set the stage for really only one choice to be made. And that one choice is to put a blaster to his head.
Yes.
I mean, that is the implication, correct, David?
Yeah, that pretty much is, especially when I thought it was actually brilliant because we didn't really see him get killed, but it's heavily implied that he did.
He was going on his last
It was a mob hit. It was a mob hit.
Yeah, Joe Pesci was going to pop up behind him and say, "You cocksucker, motherfucker."
Pretty much. Because when you see Luthen's agent, it's like, I thought it was a really cool moment and really brilliantly done to show, yeah, we don't have to show him getting killed, but you allude to it.
Yeah.
And you allude that basically, yeah, Luthen took care of this.
And he may not be dead yet. We may actually see that at the beginning of the next episode. Although it seems pretty clear that it was going to happen at that moment.
Yeah.
But David, what this did was Mon Mothma was already a very intriguing character in the first season. But now she's managed to justify, veer away from hard work. Meaning, yes, she is in danger. I'm not trying to diminish what she's doing as a rebel leader or a member of the rebellion. But she's also choosing what she does and what she doesn't do, and she has had the luxury, David, so far, of choosing not to take people's lives.
Yeah.
Luthen has done that. In fact, we even saw that conflict last season where she wasn't overly happy with what Luthen was doing. She felt that he went too far. But now suddenly she is forced to confront the very real possibility that Luthen's tactics do in fact work, and she must actually subscribe to his strategy.
Yeah.
Otherwise, she will be thrown in jail. Her family will be destroyed. And even worse, I'm sure in her mind, the rebellion will take a major hit. So what do? Well, really the only thing you can do is shoot or kill this guy. And
even if it's your friend.
And it tosses her into complete, I mean, you could say existential, but I would say it at this moment, maybe eventually it will lead to existentialism. But at this moment, it is sheer nihilism in a lot of ways. And it goes hand in hand with, or I should say, that interpretation does in fact go hand in hand with Genevieve O'Reilly's own interpretation of that scene. Hold on, I have it here.
Okay.
Currently, I have it here in front of me. If I can find it. Maybe I don't have it. Oh, so Mon Mothma explains her dance. A lot of people were thinking she turned towards hedonism and that it was just a moment of revelry. Well, she says, don't get this confused, and she said this in a recent interview, this was not about revelry. She said, "My dance at the end of episode 3 reflects," and this is how I interpreted it, "a physical chaos." Now, what does that mean, David? Well, okay, physical chaos in existential philosophy, and that's why I say that it may end up being pushed into existentialist thought. In existential philosophy, especially figures like Camus and Sartre, chaos often symbolizes the collapse of external structures that once gave meaning.
Yes.
For example, religion, politics, family, tradition. So Mon's drunken, almost desperate dancing is an embodied recognition that everything that once counted, that she once counted on, her marriage, her family, her friends, her social standing, even the rebellion's supposed righteousness, has fractured.
It's fractured.
So there is no longer a stable reason or order that guides her life. She is dancing in the wreckage. How perfectly poetic
Oh yeah,
was
because
that scene?
you have to think prior to that scene, her scene with Luthen, where Luthen basically, I think the line was, I gotta find it. It's the
People fail. That's
Yeah.
our curse.
That's our curse. And then, like, you have to remember, taking into the fact that Mon Mothma at this point, you can make the argument that basically her character is one of idealism. She's like the constant idealist.
Mm-hmm.
And in this scene, her entire character is crushed by Luthen because Luthen gives her a quote unquote reality check. You know, being idealist is nice, but if you're an idealist who doesn't understand, hey, all those things that we are fighting for the cause that we are doing this, has to have a price. You have to do some work into it.
Idealism leads to activism. Activism leads to true rebellion. And those two stages are separated by miles.
Yeah. And like, it takes so long, it takes so much work that sometimes some idealists do not realize this.
Yeah.
And that is that scene in summary between Luthen and Mon Mothma. And for a character like Mon Mothma, that is like the harshest reality check she could have gotten. And that's why everything she believed in, she now questions. She now has doubts in it.
Yeah.
And it creates that chaos, that psychological chaos that causes her to do that scene. And yeah, it is poetically brilliant.
And then you have that song, David, and we talked about this. Let me pause it. I don't want to get hit with the
with the
YouTube
copy strike.
violations. But we talk a lot about forcing things. The things that captured us as Star Wars fans, right? They were organic.
Yeah.
So our love of Boba Fett was organic. Lucas didn't force Boba Fett and say, look it guys, this is going to be your next great hero. We all gravitated to Fett.
Too fat. Yeah.
No, Darth Maul, we gravitated to Darth Maul. He died. Air quotes.
Air quotes.
In the first movie. He was done. He was never intended to be this big, grand story or this big, grand character that would be interweaved into other stories behind the scenes. We gravitated to him. Organically, things happen. You can't force pop culture phenoms to just appear from the ether. They usually happen organically. And that goes for the Imperial March, songs, things like R2 and C-3PO. I can go on and on. I think you get what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
Grogu is actually a good example of a Disney era accident.
There you go.
Grogu was not contrived and forced to be this character, this cultural artifact that everyone's going to gravitate to. There are other things in modern Star Wars, Disney Star Wars, that we can point to and say that is what they were doing. BB-8. And then that one useless character in Rise of Skywalker. Hey!
Yep.
Like things like that. That's them forcing. So now, looking back at Andor, we have a song that Mon Mothma and her fellow Chandrilians dance to. I'm going to play it again. Okay, so I'm a club kid from the early 2000s, so I just love EDM music in general.
Oh, yeah.
But the reason why I'm bringing this up right now, David, is within 24 hours of this episode airing, there were 20 plus remixes of this song done by EDM performers.
Yeah.
Because this is one of those things that was created organically, and this song is going to take and has taken the internet world by storm. A lot of these things happen through skill. Even though it's organic, if you have a skill set, you know what pop culture craves subconsciously. And you create it.
Yeah.
And that's something that Andor has done now at least 2 or 3 times during its short run. I mean, dude, Rogue One itself is a happy organic accident. No one thought Rogue One was a standalone movie. It was never designed to go anywhere else. But it hit and connected with pop culture and Star Wars fans at a level that Disney did not expect. And now here we are again. Elements of Andor connecting with people accidentally. That's how you create a stable audience. That's how you generate new audiences. And that's how you give yourself and your franchise a future.
Yeah.
So I loved really every part of the opening 3 episodes. I know there were some complaints, David, about Andor's story. They're saying it's very similar to last year in the opening where it was just kind of felt stalled. But
Which is weird because I didn't find it stalled. I actually found it, as I alluded to, very surprisingly fast.
Yes. There was a moment where I was wondering, like, what is the point here? Like, why is he here for so long?
Yeah.
But by the end, you get it. A, he's on Yavin 4. That's huge.
That's huge.
Number 2, it's setting or at least fleshing out the idea that there are other rebel factions out there and they don't even know who they are, who each other are. Is that even the right way of saying that? They don't know each other. There we go. They don't know each other, and they don't know really what they're organized by or what they're fighting necessarily. Because you have to remember, politically speaking, there's still a lot of confusion here. There are people from the Trade Federation at the end of Revenge of the Sith, chronologically speaking. You had surviving members of the Trade Federation who opposed and hated the Empire because they essentially were just reformatted. It was the Republic reformatted reformulated into the Empire.
Into the Empire.
So the problems they had with the Republic were still there, and then exponentially because it became an empire. So you had a lot of people not certain who to align themselves with, because you also had people within the Republic, the Jedi, amongst many other, who were not all about democracy being given up. So now you had no place for them. They had no home. So who do they join? Do they create their own rebellion, or do they join the very people they were fighting against just last week? So that's, in a lot of ways, they have to make sense of that. And that's, I think, what they're doing this season. We know Rebels already did a little bit of that legwork.
Yes.
They explained that the factions were not united. Mothma actually played a part in the Rebels cartoon, and I believe she actually said something to that effect, that she needed to bring the factions together. It was time.
It was time, yeah. And that's the thing, is kind of like, I like about, one of the best elements I liked about the 3 episodes is showing the controlled chaos that is the beginning of the rebellion.
Yeah.
You see these people unhappy with their lives, and that the Empire is the one that's affecting all of them. They want to have change, but right now they don't know how to do it. They think they do, but they realize that basically, you know, to kind of simplify it, the Empire is just too massive to take on.
Yeah.
And, you know, these little factions are trying to do their best, and unfortunately they don't have the organization to rise up yet.
Well, and also I really like that, and for a lot of reasons, because it shows how important the Jedi mattered to the galaxy.
Exactly.
If you just had the Empire rise and the Republic fall apart, and then suddenly the rebellion comes together and they wage a very powerful, organized war against the Empire, well, then we're left as viewers wondering, well, what's the
point of the Jedi?
Well, the Jedi didn't really matter then.
That's one of the things.
We need a 20-year vacuum of them trying to figure it out. It's about 20 years roughly, right? Between Revenge of the Sith and
New Hope.
So we need to see what it really means for the Jedi to be what's the light, for their light to be distinguished or
the light
extinguished.
Of the galaxy.
The light of the galaxy to be extinguished. We need to feel that. And that's something that I am grateful that modern Star Wars fans, or I should say modern Star Wars creators, Disney, specifically Tony Gilroy, and even Dave Filoni with Rebels, they show that this isn't an easy battle, that the Jedi did in fact matter. The Jedi would, if the Jedi were here right now, this might not have happened if they weren't manipulated, or at least they would have been able to mount a more powerful rebuttal or reaction. So it goes to show you that the reason why they're disorganized is because they don't have the leadership of the Jedi, and they have to now do this on their own. They have to organize on their own. And that's part of the reason why I'm glad that Tony Gilroy has not brought in Jedi, have not brought in Ezra or Kanan or Ahsoka. Not that I'm opposed to them being brought in a small capacity when it's needed, if he in fact is going to do that. But I'm glad that he's cautious about that, because he needs to show that the Rebel Alliance does in fact form because of the actions of the many.
Exactly. Instead of like a smaller group, a smaller powerful group like the Jedi, it's time for the ordinary people to kind of like rise up.
Right.
They need to actually be the ones to kind of fill the role that the Jedi, the vacuum that their absence is making. And that's why I liked about kind of like the interesting parallels that Tony Gilroy has done by using Cassian and showing his parallel with every single of the characters, because it creates this dynamic in my brain that basically shows all these people are just, there's no superpowers to them. They're not heroes. They're ordinary people. And they're not Jedis who can go around and slay like Imperial soldiers like nothing,
Yeah.
They're ordinary people that basically have to figure out how to survive.
And then when the Jedi do return and enter, then, they're the organizing variable. In a lot of ways, Luke's appearance is more important this way because he is the organizing agent.
Yeah. Because think about it. I mean, even when you get to Mandalorian, that point, you begin to realize that there's a more reverence to the fact that, oh my God, a Jedi can show up. And if if a Jedi shows up, everyone either A, is super grateful and awe-inspired, or B, like the Empire, terrified.
Yeah.
So that's the thing that I kind of find interesting looking at this new era of Star Wars, is kind of like how, given when we talk about like the negativity of the Star Wars franchise right now, there's a lot of positive to talk about. Is like some of the stories that they've done have given depth to a lot of the meanings of the universe in Star Wars.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, David. So let's bring this discussion to an end. We're going to get into a few more things that we ran out of time to discuss in this particular episode. So if you're a Patreon subscriber, or you want to be, head over to patreon.com/rainbowdigital and pledge $1 or more, and you'll gain access to our additional ancillary discussions. We're just going to touch on some things that we didn't have time to get into. We'll talk a little bit more about Yavin 4, Mothma's daughter, and a few other things that we know is going to come with so much dread. So, all right, David, thank you.
Thank you. May the Force be with us.